The bright yellow violation notice stuck to our front door was the fifth one that month, and it made my blood boil as I crumpled it up and tossed it into the growing pile of Karen Thompson's HOA warnings. My sister Sarah's electric wheelchair whirred up the ramp behind me, her tired smile barely hiding the exhaustion etched under her eyes from her demanding new job. Though she never complained. Not about work, not about the car accident 6 months ago that left her disabled, and not even about Karen's relentless harassment. I muttered about how being HOA president should keep Karen busy enough without her stalking our house, watching through the kitchen window as she stood in her driveway, snapping photos of our ramp with her phone, her spiteful expression clashing with her perfectly highlighted hair and designer workout gear. Sarah just sighed, asking if it was another love letter from our wonderful neighbor, and I couldn't help but marvel at her patience. Patience I was quickly losing as Karen's vendetta against the ramp escalated into something far uglier than I'd ever imagined. We followed every rule when we installed that ramp, hired a licensed contractor, secured city permits, even painted it to match our house trim. But Karen had stormed over before the concrete dried, waving her HOA rulebook like a weapon, citing Section 8, Paragraph 3 about external modifications needing board approval. Her voice dripped with fake concern about maintaining property values, but what really burned me was how she accidentally scheduled HOA meetings about the ramp when Sarah couldn't attend, knowing full well Sarah was too busy recovering and working to fight back in person. I'd kept our secret close. Sarah wasn't just any homeowner. She was the state governor. But we'd wanted privacy during her recovery, so the neighborhood didn't know who they were messing with. Last week, I'd caught Karen measuring the ramp at 6 a.m., claiming it was her duty as president when I confronted her. And that's when I started documenting everything, videos, notices, a detailed log, because my gut screamed we'd need it. This morning felt different, though. As I helped Sarah into her car for physical therapy, I spotted Karen huddled with two men in suits near her house, pointing at our ramp and gesturing wildly while one scribbled in a notebook and the other took photos. I told Sarah I didn't like it, suggesting maybe it was time to reveal who she really was, but she shook her head, insisting she wouldn't use her position for special treatment. We'd handle it the right way through proper channels. Yet, as I watched Karen hand thick manila envelopes to the men with a triumphant smile, I couldn't shake the dread that proper channels might not cut it this time. Her voice floated across the yards on the morning breeze, saying they'd need a bulldozer here first thing tomorrow. The board had already approved the removal. My heart stopped. They couldn't really tear down a wheelchair ramp, could they? And as Sarah's car rounded the corner, I rushed inside to check our security cameras and grab our permit folder, only to stumble on something in our files that would turn this petty HOA spat into Karen's worst nightmare. I was halfway through my breakfast when the low rumble of heavy machinery jolted me from my chair, my spoon clattering against the bowl as I bolted to the window to see Karen in our front yard, her red blazer a stark contrast to the gray dawn, pointing at Sarah's wheelchair ramp while a construction worker nodded along. A bright yellow bulldozer loomed in our driveway, its metal blade glinting menacingly as two workers in orange vests measured the ramp with yellow tape, and Karen clutched a stack of papers like they were her ticket to victory. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I ran outside, the neighborhood still asleep under the early sun. "What do you think you're doing?" I called, my voice shakier than I'd hoped, but Karen turned with that fake HOA meeting smile, her heels sinking into our grass as she chirped about an emergency order from the board, claiming the ramp violated community guidelines, Section 4.23, and waved a paper just out of my reach. I took a deep breath, Sarah's campaign trick, and reminded her we had city approval, but she cut me off, saying the city wasn't the HOA and this eyesore was dragging down property values, her smile unwavering as the bulldozer's engine revved, making my stomach lurch. I pulled up the property map Sarah had me save on my phone, showing our permits and lines, and told Karen this was illegal, demolishing property without proper notice or a court order. But she just laughed, a shrill sound that grated on my nerves, flashing a certified mail receipt with a signature I didn't recognize, claiming notice was given 3 weeks ago. Frantic, I dialed Sarah, but it went to voicemail. She was in a budget meeting. Then her assistant, her security, anyone, but no one picked up. And as the workers set orange cones around our driveway, one hesitated, whispering to his partner while double-checking his paperwork, clearly sensing something off. "If you do this, you'll hear from our lawyers. This violates the Americans with Disabilities Act," I warned, my voice steadying as I went live on my phone, capturing every detail, and Corinne's smile flickered when I shouted that no HOA was exempt from federal law, loud enough to wake the neighbors. Mr. Rodriguez poked his head out, then ducked back inside when he saw her. She gave the bulldozer operator a sharp nod, and the machine roared, its treads crunching our driveway as the blade lowered toward the ramp we'd fought so hard to build. I stood frozen, phone steady, yelling it was her last chance, that she was making a huge mistake, but Corinne turned, eyes cold despite her grin, saying the only mistake was letting this monstrosity get built, that rules existed for a reason. The blade hit the ramp with a sickening screech, concrete crumbling as I recorded every second. What she didn't see was Mr. Rodriguez re-emerging with his own camera, or the neighbors gathering, phones raised. And then my phone buzzed. Sarah's head of security texting. "Stay calm, keep recording, help is 3 minutes out." And I smiled for the first time that morning, watching Corinne orchestrate the destruction like a conductor, oblivious to the black SUVs turning onto our street and the faint sirens growing louder. She was so caught up in her triumph, she didn't realize the biggest mistake wasn't the ramp. It was not knowing who lived here. And that tiny oversight was about to unravel her entire HOA career in spectacular fashion. Our quiet suburban street erupted into chaos just as Corinne was high-fiving her HOA cronies over the ramp's demise. Her smug grin dissolving into confusion when the first black SUV screeched around the corner, followed by 2 more and 3 state police cruisers, red and blue lights painting the dawn sky. My hands trembled as I kept recording, neighbors spilling onto their lawns, phones out, curtains flung wide, sensing the drama about to unfold, and I couldn't suppress a grin as 5 identical government vehicles rolled up behind the police, turning our cul-de-sac into a movie set. Corinne's voice cracked as she demanded to know what was happening, insisting this was a private neighborhood matter. Then Sarah's lead security stepped out, scanning the scene before opening the middle SUV's door, and the street fell silent as my sister emerged in her wheelchair, her governor's blazer sharp against the rubble, her expression pure steel, the one she saved for major press conferences, and she rolled forward, her team fanning out around her, as Corinne's face cycled through shock, fear, and disbelief in seconds. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah's voice cut through the morning air, steady and commanding, "this became a state matter the moment you violated federal disability laws, not to mention destroying state property without authorization." And she pulled out her phone, offering to show Corinne the deed or dive into the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, which she'd just strengthened last month. The crowd swelled. Mrs. Jenkins was already live on Facebook, as Corinne stammered about HOA bylaws, clutching her violation notices like a lifeline, but Sarah motioned to her assistant, who stepped up with a thick binder, revealing her legal team had spent the afternoon dissecting those bylaws and found multiple state housing violations, discriminatory practices, and irregular financial records spanning 3 years. The neighbors gasped. I zoomed in on Corinne's whitening face, and her board members started edging away as she sputtered that she didn't know Sarah was the governor, or that bulldozing a disabled person's ramp was a federal offense. Her excuses crumbling as 2 state investigators approached, notebooks ready, news vans lining up at the street's end. "Mrs. Thompson," one investigator said, voice flat, "we'll need you to come with us to answer questions about today and these financial discrepancies." And as Corinne was led off, still muttering about property values and clutching her rulebook, Sarah turned to the crowd, every inch the leader despite sitting amid the ramp's ruins. "My fellow neighbors," she began, gesturing to the wreckage, "today we can discuss what community really means. This isn't just about my access to my home. It's about everyone's right to live with dignity here." And I saw shame, anger, and understanding ripple through the faces watching her, phones still rolling as police cars flanked the scene. Karen glanced back from the cruiser, her reign of HOA terror ending not with a bang but a whimper. And as I watched her go, I wondered what this explosive evening meant for our neighborhood. How many other Karens were out there pulling the same stunts, hiding behind bylaws and fake smiles, oblivious to the reckoning they'd face when someone finally fought back. The morning after Karen's bulldozing fiasco, I woke to my phone buzzing like a beehive. Our security footage had gone viral overnight, racking up millions of views, and news vans clogged our street, their satellite dishes glinting in the sun as reporters clamored for a scoop. But the real shock came when my old high school buddy, now a civil rights lawyer, called with files proving Karen had been sued 3 times before in other neighborhoods for similar HOA stunts. Ramps removed, fines for accessibility mods, all settled quietly before she'd slink off to torment a new community. This time, she'd picked the wrong house, and Sarah wasn't just mad, she was strategic, calling an emergency press conference on our front lawn with the ramp's debris as her backdrop. Reporters lost it when she revealed a stack of documents showing Karen had broken federal disability laws plus 17 state housing regulations. But what floored me was our neighbors stepping up. Mrs. Chen admitting Karen forced her to ditch her medicinal garden, Mr. Rodriguez showing fines for his dad's wheelchair lift, even the Bakers confessing threats over their autistic son's sensory playground. Suddenly, our street felt like strangers bound by shared scars. Karen tried to rally her troops with an emergency HOA meeting to counter these unfounded accusations. But only her 2 loyal board cronies showed, while Sarah turned our house into a hub for disability rights advocates, half the neighborhood piling in to learn about accessible housing. Folks who'd barely waved before now swapping stories over coffee. Then the bomb dropped. Someone leaked Karen's HOA financials, revealing she'd funneled fine money into her own home renovations, calling them board-approved community improvements. And the fallout was instant. Her lawyer quit. 3 board members resigned via furious emails that hit the local news. Yet Karen doubled down, storming our porch the next morning with a cease and desist letter, accusing us of lies. She didn't expect to interrupt Sarah's meeting with the state housing commissioner, who took one look at her and asked for every HOA decision she'd made in 5 years. Karen's face went from smug to ashen as her empire crumbled, and I almost felt bad for her, but not quite, not after everything she'd done. The best part wasn't her downfall, though. It was our neighbors planting, support accessible housing signs in their yards one by one, until Karen's house stood alone, a silent island of defeat. News choppers caught it all, and by sunset, our story hit national headlines, a wildfire sparked by one ramp. That evening, folks gathered on our lawn, sharing tales of Karen's tyranny. Mr. Jenkins showing pics of a treehouse she'd forced down, the Wilsons laughing about fines for too bright Christmas lights, and planning a new, inclusive HOA, a phoenix rising from the rubble she'd left behind. But the night wasn't done. Sarah got documents tying the bulldozing company to Karen's private contracting gig, a cozy little side hustle that explained her rush to destroy our ramp. And as I watched the crowd grow, I marveled at how one petty grudge had ignited this reckoning. How had we gone from violation notices to a movement, and what else was lurking in those files that might shake our world again? The next morning, my phone was a war zone. Hundreds of messages from neighbors spilling their own HOA horror stories, news outlets begging for interviews. But what stopped me cold was an email from Mrs. Rodriguez. Our elderly neighbor Karen had fined for a garden gnome, attaching proof of more laws Karen broke. I spent the day hunched over HOA rules, highlighters flying, while Sarah's legal team uncovered that Karen never even filed to become president. She just seized power when the old one moved, and no one dared challenge her. The deeper we dug, the dirtier it got, until our story hit Tommy Chin, a YouTube lawyer famous for exposing unfair housing rules, who flew in to meet Sarah and offered to sue Karen and the HOA pro bono. His video about us exploded with millions of views in a day, and when Karen called yet another emergency meeting to save face, she faced a packed community center, not her usual sleepy duo, but a fired-up crowd sharing tales of her bullying like Mr. Jenkins, daughter's treehouse she'd forced down, or the Wilsons, 2 bright Christmas lights, all while I watched, stunned, as our quiet street turned into a battleground for justice. Sarah didn't just bask in the chaos. She rolled up to the mic and dropped a bombshell. She'd been drafting a new law, the Right to Home Happiness Act, to shield homeowners from HOA abuse, and the room erupted, cheers bouncing off the walls as folks realized this wasn't just about our ramp anymore. Then our security footage sealed it. Karen had lied on official forms about getting bulldozer approval, and her own lawyer ditched her 2 days later. We watched her pack her prized rose bushes, the ones she'd forced everyone to mimic, and move out, a defeated figure against the sunset, while the new HOA board flipped the script, turning the violations office into a community help center that sent welcome baskets instead of fines. They even launched a program for elderly home repairs, and Sarah's ramp got rebuilt. Better, with local artists painting it in vibrant flowers and soft glowing lights that neighborhood kids dubbed the street's prettiest feature. Proof that sometimes the ugliest fights birth the brightest changes. Last week, Sarah threw a barbecue in our backyard, and seeing everyone laugh where Karen once barked about grass height felt surreal. Kids ran free, Mrs. Rodriguez's gnome army multiplied, and the bulldozing company, shamed into action, offered free ramp installs statewide, their CEO personally apologizing to Sarah and starting a disability rights law scholarship. Then yesterday hit me with a curveball. I got promoted to run the state's new homeowner protection office, tasked with teaching other neighborhoods to turn their HOAs from tyrants into allies, and Sarah grinned, saying we were just getting started. After all, our story was now in school textbooks as a lesson in fighting unfair rules. But the real win wasn't the headlines or laws. It was the little stuff, like kids playing on lawns without fear of fines, or 5 neighbors helping the new family unpack at Karen's old house, complete with a ramp for their grandma and no one batting an eye. The dust had barely settled from Karen's exit when our neighborhood started feeling like a different planet. Neighbors who'd once ducked behind curtains now waved over fences. And the new HOA board's first meeting was a packed house, not to scold, but to brainstorm ways to make our street a real community, like turning the old fine system into a fund for shared projects. Sarah's rebuilt ramp, now a glowing floral masterpiece, became a symbol of that shift. Kids rode bikes past it, grinning, while Mrs. Chen replanted her medicinal garden with help from the Wilsons, and Mr. Rodriguez's gnome army grew bolder each day. Even the bulldozing company, desperate to scrub their name clean, partnered with us, installing ramps for disabled residents across the state and funding that scholarship Sarah inspired. But what hit me hardest was walking past Karen's old house, sold last week to a family with 3 kids, 2 dogs, and a ramp for their grandma, and seeing 5 neighbors unload their moving truck, a quiet act of welcome that said more than any headline ever could. My new gig running the homeowner protection office kicked off with a flood of emails. HOA victims statewide spilling tales of petty tyrants like Karen, from fines for porch swings to bans on rainbow flags, and I spent days with Sarah's team crafting workshops to flip those boards into helpers, not bullies. Tommy Chin's video kept racking up views, turning our ramp saga into a rallying cry. People mailed us support accessible housing signs, and schools invited Sarah to speak about the Right to Home Happiness Act, which was speeding through the legislature faster than Karen's bulldozer ever did. She'd grin at me during late-night planning sessions, saying this was bigger than us now, and I believed her, watching our story ripple out like a stone in a pond. The barbecue had been the tipping point. Laughter replaced violation notices, and folks swapped recipes instead of grievances. But when the bulldozing company's CEO showed up with that apology and a check, it felt like the universe was winking at us, proving even the worst players could pivot when the spotlight burned hot enough. Karen's ghost lingered, though, not in her empty house, but in the questions folks started asking. How many other HOAs were pulling her tricks, hiding behind bylaws to punish instead of protect? Sarah's legal team found more dirt. The contracting tie wasn't just a side hustle. Karen had skimmed HOA dues through it for years, and the state housing commissioner launched a full audit of every board she'd ever touched, uncovering a trail of bullied homeowners who'd never spoken up. Our neighbors didn't just cheer. They organized, block parties replaced board meetings, and the new HOA funded a playground the Bakers had begged for, sensory-friendly and open to all. While I fielded calls from reporters still hungry for the next twist, wondering if Karen would resurface with some desperate counterattack. But as I watched that new family's kids chase their dogs across a lawn Karen once ruled, I realized her reign was truly dead, and we'd built something stronger in its ashes. The neighborhood's transformation kept gaining speed, like a train no one could stop. Block parties popped up weekly. The new HOA board greenlit a community garden where Karen's fine threats once reigned. And Sarah's ramp, now a local landmark, drew visitors who snapped pics of its glowing flowers, turning our street into a quiet symbol of defiance. My homeowner protection office was swamped. Calls from across the state poured in. Tailies of HOA presidents banning birdhouses or fining folks for faded shutters. And I'd sit with Sarah late into the night, mapping out toolkits to empower residents, her Right to Home Happiness Act. Now law after a landslide vote, its ink barely dry before towns started rewriting their bylaws. Tommy Chin flew back for a follow-up video, interviewing neighbors like Mr. Rodriguez, whose gnome army now spanned his whole yard, and the Bakers, whose son giggled on their new playground. Our story's views hit tens of millions, and schools kept booking Sarah to teach kids how one ramp sparked a revolution. But the real kicker came when the state audit of Karen's old HOAs wrapped. Dozens of boards had mimicked her playbook, and now they were scrambling to clean house or face lawsuits, all because we'd cracked the lid off their petty empires. That bulldozing company turned into an unlikely ally. Their CEO, red-faced from the scandal, didn't just fund ramps. He lobbied for disability rights at the Capitol, and their scholarship sent its first student to law school last month, a kid who'd watched our fight online and swore to keep it going. Karen's old contracting scheme unraveled too. Turns out she'd funneled HOA cash through fake invoices for years, and the commissioner's office hit her with fraud charges, her name splashed across papers as the poster child for HOA greed. She'd vanished after moving, but rumors swirled she was plotting a comeback, though no one here cared. Our lawns buzzed with kids and dogs, not violation notices. The new family in her house threw a barbecue last weekend, and half the street showed, totting casseroles and stories of how they'd quietly hated Karen's rules. Mrs. Chen even gifted them a gnome, grinning as she said it was tradition now. And I realized we hadn't just ousted a tyrant. We'd rewritten what neighbor meant, one small win at a time. Work kept me on my toes. Teaching neighborhoods to ditch their Karens was a full-time crusade, and Sarah's team tracked copycat movements popping up nationwide, folks waving our signs and quoting her law like a battle cry. The press still circled, hungry for updates, but the real story wasn't in their headlines. It was in the Wilsons stringing Christmas lights brighter than ever, or the Jenkins rebuilding that treehouse with no permit fights, all while our security footage played in civics classes, a grainy testament to standing up. As I walked past that new family's ramp, built without a peep of protest, I wondered how far this could go, how many streets could shed their petty dictators, and whether Karen, wherever she was, regretted picking our house that fateful day. A year after Karen's bulldozer roared through our lives, our street barely resembled its old self. Community gardens bloomed where violation notices once landed. The new HOA threw summer fairs instead of fines, and Sarah's ramp, now a glowing beacon of flowers and lights, drew strangers who left notes thanking us for fighting, their stories of rogue HOAs mirroring ours. My homeowner protection office had grown into a statewide force, workshops packed with residents eager to reclaim their neighborhoods, armed with Sarah. Right to Home Happiness Act, which had sparked a national push, with 10 states drafting their own versions while Tommy Chin's videos kept the fire alive, our ramp saga a rallying cry for millions. The bulldozing company's redemption arc held strong. They'd installed over 100 ramps, their scholarship fund thriving, and their CEO spoke at Sarah's latest press conference, crediting her for showing them profit didn't trump decency. Meanwhile, Karen's fraud charges stuck, her name a cautionary tale in housing law seminars, though whispers of her plotting a return never materialized. She'd faded into obscurity, her rose bushes long gone from our view. Our neighbors didn't just heal, they thrived. Mrs. Rodriguez's gnome army was a tourist draw, the baker's playground buzzed with kids, and the new family's ramp stood proud, a quiet nod to how far we'd come. Sarah and I kept pushing. Her speeches filled auditoriums, my office trained activists, and our story hit textbooks, a gritty lesson in civics that kids debated in class. But the real victory unfolded in the everyday. The Wilsons, blinding Christmas lights, the Jenkins, treehouse towering guilt-free, and block parties where folks swapped seeds, not gripes. The state audit had toppled a dozen mini-Karens, their HOAs dissolving under scrutiny, and our signs. Support accessible housing, dotted lawns nationwide, a grassroots wave we hadn't dared dream of. Even the press eased off, sensing the story wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to every street shedding its old skin, inspired by one ramp and a sister who wouldn't bend. That barbecue at the new family's place last month sealed it. 5 neighbors helped unpack, Mrs. Chen handed over a gnome, and kids chased dogs across a lawn Karen once policed, laughter drowning out the ghost of her rulebook. I caught Sarah's eye across the yard, her grin saying what words couldn't, that the worst moment, that bulldozer's screech, had birthed the best change, a legacy neither of us saw coming. Looking back, it's wild how it started. One yellow notice, one petty grudge, spiraling into a movement that rewrote laws and minds. I still get emails from strangers thanking us. They're HOAs now helpers, not tyrants, and Sarah says we're just warming up. Her next bill targets shady contractors, a nod to Karen's side hustle. But the win I hold tightest isn't the big stuff. It's the little shifts, like seeing Mr. Rodriguez tend his gnomes without fear, or the new family's grandma rolling down her ramp to join us, no permits required. That's when I knew we didn't just beat Karen or fix an HOA. We changed what home could mean, proving sometimes the smallest stand, the shakiest voice, can topple a giant and build something better in the rubble.